and welcome to today's webinar, Addressing the Top 3 Ways to Overcome Your Budget and Operations Challenges. I'm Ann Cosgrove, the Editor-in-Chief of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar today is presented by Canon Business Process Services. Before I introduce your speakers today, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items for you. First, please note the control panel that's on your screen. This is where you can submit questions in the question box in that panel. Please send your questions in at any time, and your speakers will address them either during and after the presentation. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of the control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the panel, so please be sure it is expanded so you can access that question box. If at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send a message to us in that question box and we'll reply to you quickly. And now we'll have an overview of our agenda for the hour. Today, your two speakers will be addressing facility services. There will be industry trends discussed, along with challenges facing facility management today, diving then into the top 3 ways to overcome the challenges: people, process, technology. And then there'll be a discussion of effectively teaming with a managed services provider, along with some Canon case studies, and then that's when we will get into some Q&A at the end, and as I mentioned, during, if you send in questions during. So with that, I will introduce your two speakers for today. Brendan Akista is National Accounts Executive with Canon Business Process Services, and Brendan has more than 20 years of experience in managed services focused on service excellence, client satisfaction, and business optimization at client sites. He has extensive experience working with facilities and operations professionals on improving their operations at complex facilities, advancing logistics, document management, and workflow solutions, and print and mail services as well. Joe Tague is Senior Manager, Business Applications with Canon Business Process Services, and he has more than 20 years of experience applying business solutions in a range of areas, including facility management, campus logistics, and office services. Joe specializes in the implementation of process improvement service programs and integrating technology systems into the solutions. So with that, I will hand it over to Brendan Akista. Hi, Brendan.
Hi, Ann. Thanks very much. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thank you for the chance to make this presentation. And I just want to thank all the participants and attendees for attending today's presentation. Here we just talk a little bit about who we are. And this is really just a very brief overview, just so people kind of know about our organization. You may or may not have heard of us, but Canon Business Process Services is just a subsidiary of Canon. Canon is usually synonymous with cameras, but Canon's a $31 billion global revenue organization, leads 3rd overall in U.S. patents registered in 2015, clearly a very admired company by Fortune magazine, and they're headquartered in Melville, New York. So as I said, we're a subsidiary of Canon. Our corporate headquarters is in Manhattan, and we've got offices all over the country. There are about 600 client sites that we support, and they're supported by about 4,500 field employees. Something that's unique is that we take a kind of a unique integrator approach to providing services, and maybe we'll touch on this a little later, what that means a little later in the presentation. One of the things that really doesn't show up on this slide is that Canon Business Process Services was founded in 1959 as an on-demand courier company, and I think really what's important to our clients about that is we've now got about 60 years of experience in how do you find, recruit, train, manage, motivate, career develop, entry-level and middle management employees, and that's something that we're especially good at. This slide really talks about, when we talk to facilities managers about where they go for cost savings, the feedback we get is that historically these are the kind of buckets or service areas that they look for savings. And while this is not an all-encompassing list, it certainly does have its limitations. If you look at these areas, there's only so much you can kind of bleed out of this financially. I mean, how many times can you reevaluate suppliers or release RFPs before all the low-hanging fruit has kind of been drained out of this? So what we think is that you need to really kind of think out of the box or think differently about where savings could come going into the future. These are kind of non-traditional facilities management services. So if you look at this, the right-hand part of the slide there, those bullets, one area that facilities managers are looking is to corporate campus logistics and warehousing. And what we mean by this, by definition, this is just a service that ensures the efficient flow of materials that are consumed by the facility and by the residents of the facility at large, multi-office campuses. So usually what this type of operation looks like is, there's a receiving, there's storage or warehousing component, there's an inventory control, there's a distribution of materials. And really close examination of these areas can reduce the number of people that are required to provide these services and the space that's required to manage this critical function. Another area that y'all are looking at is the MAC business, or moves, adds, changes. And whether it's individual office moves or complete departmental relocations, a close look at this function, again, can reduce costs through headcount reduction opportunities. If you look at office services in our world, that would just be things like reception, conference scheduling, conference room setup and breakdown, special event planning, security, and a close look at how you can integrate these services with maybe other services that are being provided can also provide cost savings opportunities. When we talk about mail management and production management, the mail management is just inbound and outbound management of USPS. The production management is inbound and outbound high volume correspondence. So in the insurance world, it could be things like inbound claims, could be outbound explanation of benefits, just a very high volume of correspondence. And evaluation could lead to headcount reduction and also space requirement reductions as well, leading to cost savings. In the area of shipping and receiving, it's just really inbound and outbound accountable materials, so the FedExes, the UPSs of the world, and again, could include things like hazmat materials that are coming into a warehouse or a lab or things of that nature. So again, the same philosophy applies here. It's an opportunity that if you closely evaluate this, there might be a chance to reduce the amount of people that are required to provide these services, as well as the amount of space that's required to provide these services. And lastly, and probably most out of the box or most different service would be to look at information governance, print, and business process outsourcing. So things like, how do you manage information and records? Are you storing files on site? Are you taking advantage of imaging technologies? Are you imaging and storing documents electronically? How do you get these documents into a workflow? And the answers to these questions can greatly impact space and headcount requirements and obviously costs. So again, this is an area that, the big challenge in looking at these types of functions is that historically they might reside outside of the span of control of facilities managers. But a good example is, on the information governance side, we were working with a large insurance organization that came to us and said, we've got to free up space, we've got to reduce costs, we have more people coming into our organization, we don't want to lease more square footage, what can we do? And we basically went to them and said, you're now storing files at a departmental level. It's got its own customer service issues, but from a pure cost and square footage requirement, you're storing about 80,000 square foot of files in Class A space in your corporate office. So we designed a program for them where they could take all those files, put it in a centralized location, a warehouse, much cheaper space. And ultimately, to take it a step further is, and this took a couple of years, but over the course of about 3 years, we ultimately imaged all of those files for them and got them out of that warehouse. So a tremendous cost savings and a great improvement in customer service, because now information was readily available to everybody on their computer at the touch of a button versus trying to requisition files and get that information. So there's just a good example of that. If we talk about trends and kind of what we're seeing in the facilities and real estate marketplace, we're seeing the expansion of centralized campuses. And This is really in order to close down more regional offices. So we're seeing a lot of regional offices or offices around the city consolidate into one centralized kind of campus environment. And it's really going on for more than just the reason of reducing space and trying to save money. Companies are trying to create, collaborative work environments where people get a chance to interface with each other on a daily basis, work in the same space. They're trying to create a work environment that enables the company to both recruit top talent, but also to retain top talent. So they really want to create a friendly, collaborative work environment. We're also seeing the engagement of organizations with corporate real estate and facilities management companies. So companies are going out and hiring the likes of and we'll give them a little plug here, the Jones Lang LaSalle's and the CBREs of the world to help manage your real estate portfolios. And we're really witnessing the integration of facilities management. So what we mean by that is really the consolidation of all of the services that we just discussed under one supplier. And this provides efficiencies, eliminates redundancies, streamlines the supply chain, leverages the resources that are already on site, reduces headcount, reduces space, provides cost reductions, and in the end, more importantly, or equally as importantly, it improves the level of customer service that's being delivered to the residents of the campus. We talk about some of the challenges that you're faced with right now, and I'm not going to hit on every one of these bullets, but if we just highlight a couple of the top ones here, facilities managers are telling us we have to save money. There's just no way around it. We just have to reduce costs. We're being given a reduced budget. We've got to find ways to operate within a reduced budget. And I think one of the interesting things that we find when we talk to facilities managers is that, from about 2009 up until about a year or two ago, this was a little bit of a more manageable process. Companies were coming out of the financial crisis. They were typically downsizing. They had less employees. And just as a pure function of downsizing, it became possible to reduce their facilities budget. But what we've really seen over the last 18 months, last year, companies are really entering into more of a steady state, or they may be growing. So it's getting harder and harder to find cost savings opportunities. The other thing is the challenge is, in light of trying to save money and having fewer resources, deliver a high level of customer satisfaction. End users are not becoming any less demanding. Companies are not lowering their expectations for customer service. In fact, they're raising them. If you go back to what we talked about earlier, we want to create an environment where we can attract top talent. We work with a large energy company, and one of the things that they tell us is that we're no longer competing with other oil and gas companies for talent. We're trying to get people away from the Googles and the Apples and the Nikes and the Microsofts of the world. And we've got to be able to provide a very, very high level of service to the end users, or it just doesn't enable us to attract those people and keep those people. I think the last one that I wanted to touch on is really this, make sensible changes with little real or consistent data. So it just becomes very difficult to kind of make decisions on how you can change things in order to save money and provide high levels of customer satisfaction when you might not have consistency in how you do reporting. So how do you measure a spend? There's one group doing it by the square footage that's out there. There's another group doing it by head count. How are you charging back for services in an environment where maybe different departments unequally use the services that are being provided at the facility? So these are the things that just come up as a challenge, and the ones I feel like I covered are probably the top 2 or 3 that we hear the most often. So what are the top 3 ways you can overcome these challenges? We talked earlier about think different. Look at non-traditional services. Don't just immediately go back to the historical services that you look for cost savings, because historically, again, they've been kind of wrung out. there's no more low-hanging fruit there. So we talked about looking at non-traditional services, and inside of these services, we feel like there's three major components or buckets that have to be closely evaluated. And the challenge, it sounds simple, but the challenge in evaluating these buckets, especially for an internal operation, is, where do you find the time or the energy or the resources or the expertise to be able to evaluate each of these different functions for cost savings and customer satisfaction improvement opportunities. Whereas really a qualified outsource provider can help you evaluate these functions. And the things they'll look at is people, process, and technology. So evaluate people, within the soft services and outside of the soft services. And we talk about soft services in a facility, I guess what we're really talking about is everything that's not like HVAC, hard building maintenance types of services. So evaluate the people. How are the operations staffed? Do the people have the right skill sets? Is the right kind of management in place or resources being shared? We'll evaluate process. So to look at soft and inside soft services and outside of soft services. So how you manage business processes, things like accounts payable, claims processing, records management, production print. How you manage these could have a significant impact on the amount of staff that's required to manage these operations, as well as the amount of space that's required. I mean, we go back to the story earlier about the insurance company that we're working for. That was a business process. And again, it's a challenge because it may have fallen outside of the responsibilities of a facilities manager, but the facilities group got with the stakeholders of those operations and found a better way to impact their budget and to provide services for the end users. So, that's really a chance to buy yourself back some very much needed space. The other thing to look at is technology. So how are you using technology to manage, facilities work orders? But also, how are you using technology to manage things like records or things like production print or things like outbound high volume production now? Again, can lead to cost savings opportunities as well as customer satisfaction opportunities. So those are the things that a qualified outsource provider would look at. And if we dive a little deeper on start out with the people side of things, again, for anyone that's read, Jim Collins' Is Good to Great, I think you'll recognize some of the terminology and the approach here. But it's really the first thing you look at is, get the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus, and get everyone in the right seat on the bus. And internally, that's sometimes a very difficult goal to achieve because of HR constraints. It can be a difficult task to undertake, whereas a qualified outsource provider will, one, provide the flexibility to achieve this change, and two, can provide the expertise to make those changes happen. We talk about leadership, strong leadership. I mean, when we measure performance and productivity and customer satisfaction, we always see that interchangeable lower-level clerical staff that are led by strong leaders score much higher than when we have, a stable clerical workforce and maybe an unstable or weaker management. So really just having strong management is key within these operations. Then these last few bullets I would really put in under kind of one big grouping, which is, better recruiting, increased training, career development rewards programs. I mean, if you look at facility services historically, is just a little bit of a no thank you business. There's just no way around it. And organizations are typically set up, an energy company is much better, and their HR group is much better at and is more geared toward how do I find great geologists, not how do I find a great mailroom clerk. A chemical company is looking for scientists. They're much better at vetting and recruiting scientists than they are warehouse managers. Whereas an outsource provider, this is their business, this is what they do. They are geared up to recruit hourly wage and middle management types of employees. And then training, development, reward programs. Again, the challenge on an internal operation, you're not really set up to do that. Most companies reward top salespeople or the rainmakers of the organization. They're not necessarily sitting around thinking about how do I develop a program to keep our warehouse team motivated to deliver world-class service each and every day. Whereas as an outsourced provider, that's your core business, that's all that you do, and you have established programs to be able to provide to the people. And on the career development side, there's typically not a lot of headroom available to people that work in these types of operations in an internal operation, whereas with a qualified outsourced provider, there is headroom, there is opportunity for advancement. There are other sites where the similar services are being provided. So there's a whole different world that becomes opened up to these people. And in the end, just really allows us, when we assess these types of operations, when we put in these types of programs for people, historically we've been able to reduce the labor cost for facility services by about 20%. Joe, I think if you want to just talk about process and technology, I could hand it over to Joe Tagg.
Thank you, Brendan. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. We appreciate that you've taken some time out of your busy day to attend this program today. I'll talk a little bit about driving cost improvements through defined process measures. Now, Brendan touched on a lot of different types of things where we're addressing process changes. Facility advancements has allowed us to identify staff synergies out there. You want to look at to eliminate redundancies, and the implementation of process modification and improvement events certainly is a great place to start. Some of the things that we listed on here, the staff synergies, we're all very familiar with that. There's kind of a core business that all the managers go through, looking at how we can do things with less people, more efficiently, all along that lines. Well, some of the other things I've added in here, like Six Sigma, which is a disciplined, data-driven approach, Kaizen and 5S events, which are defined improvement process events, usually done by the process owners or a scope of processes for improvement in those areas. And 5S events are more of the cleanup or more of the visual order, organization, cleanliness, and standardization. From that category areas, you see a lot of different things occur while finishing and going through these type of events. It opens up windows of opportunities, windows for change in those environments themselves. You go along the bottom, you talk about defined or redefined SLAs. All of us are typically under contractual obligations for SLAs with our clients or the companies that we work for. We try to identify those areas that have experienced scope creep. Maybe they have changed on those SLAs. So it's not a bad idea to reevaluate and take a look at those SLAs which could have been around cleaning or waste disposal, landscaping services, building maintenance, light services in that respect. We had a client not too long ago wanted to take a look at some of their older SLAs and how they've changed over the years, and we were actually able to look at one where we actually changed a timing mechanism within that SLA from 4 hours to a same day SLA, and it ultimately saved over $200,000 annually. Because if you look at the model of the labor involved to finish something in a 4-hour window has much more emphasis on it than if you have labor to actually fit that job into a same day type of SLA. So those are some of the things you want to look at from an SLA standpoint. And as you move over to the right part of the slide, you talk about business analytics and capturing the right data, developing meaningful reporting, and creating actionable process changes from that reporting. And data is key here, and I'll have another slide later and I'll talk a little bit more detail about it. But in this case, KPIs, performance management, what do the KPIs mean to us in the facility environment? We're quantifying and measuring different things that demonstrate how effective we are at doing our job. So those are key areas, again, to re-identify KPIs, whether it's gross FM costs, the number of end user complaints that we might see, percent of work completed that is reactive. An interesting statistic on KPIs on the reactive standpoint versus a proactive high-level maintenance approach, it typically costs 4 to 6 times more to handle a reactive process within your environment than it would if you had it scheduled and you had it planned. So really the target for reactive type of scenarios would be around 20 to 30%. So you want to actually schedule or have a scheduled maintenance type schedule for 70 to 80% of those. So measuring that helps you identify where you can make potential changes within that environment, all of those together helping to drive those cost improvements. And again, the ultimate goal is drive those cost improvements on a daily, monthly, and annual basis. And again, each on their own is very good, but if you add one or more of these together, all of them together, they become noteworthy. Next slide, Brendan.
And before we move on, I believe we do have a poll. Excuse me, Joe. And
Very
this
good.
is where we would like to ask all of you out there in the audience to please take a moment to read through the question and cast your vote. And the question is, do you currently use tracking and productivity software to aid in facilities management? Please select one. Yes, I am using off-the-shelf FM software. Yes, I am using homegrown FM software. No, but we are in the process of implementing FM software. No, but we plan to install FM software this year. Or you do not have any plans to leverage FM software. Please take a moment to cast your vote, and we will show the results shortly. Okay, so here are the results. Thank you again for voting. And the leader there, the leading answer is yes, I am using off-the-shelf FM software, followed by 33%. We do not have plans to leverage. And as you can see, 18% homegrown and 7 and 2% for the other replies. So Brendan and Joe, are you surprised by those results?
Honestly, I actually am, because I think what we have seen in many cases is organizations using homegrown systems versus buying some kind of standardized, integratable, off-the-shelf system. And there's a lot of challenges with using legacy or homegrown systems. So it's encouraging to hear that more and more are buying or are using existing kind of off-the-shelf, integratable systems to manage facilities.
Yeah, and Brendan, I would agree. 58%, that's a pretty good number. I thought maybe it might be a little bit higher with today's environments. So that's certainly something I'll touch base on as I go through what's available, what's out there, how you would use it. So hopefully we can provide some good information to the 33% that don't currently have any plans to leverage the FM software. So thank you, Ann. Great poll question. This evaluating technology slide, data-driven decision-making. Across the top, we're looking at, capturing process data, performance monitoring, and database decisions. In the capture process, we want to quantify good data. Collecting great data is very key to the understanding what's going on in your environments themselves. There's a number of different FM service type of tracking and inventory management systems out there, from work order systems, just tracking the daily activity that's taking place, to the asset tracking systems that are identifying where your computers are, where the desks are, where the key valuable items of a company are. Move planning, which is very labor intensive. You can monitor and track some of those. Warehouse management system, if you happen to have a facility that also has a warehouse module to it that you have to keep track of. These are all very key and very important to your daily workday and creating an environment that you can support and work through and make your life a little bit easier as a manager. Some of the facility management systems out there that many of you are aware of, you have CAFM, which is the computer-aided facility management systems. CMMS, which is a maintenance management software program, the EAM, which is your enterprise asset management, which is very key, and your IWMS, which is your integrated workplace management system. This is what Brendan touched base a little bit, is the integration of all of these modules into a facility services type environment where you can have modules that help you track and trace and just really have a nice snapshot of what's going on in your environment at all times. Performance monitoring, labor is probably our most expensive and your most expensive asset that's out there. So you can monitor employee effectiveness. You can also monitor equipment effectiveness from an employee standpoint, how long it takes them to complete a task, how many tasks they are completing in a month with the total number of hours, how do they compare to other employees or other benchmarks in the industry. You can get summary by projects. You can also measure the equipment effectiveness of how many times a particular HVAC unit or other type of mechanical unit is being repaired versus what its warranty should be versus obsolescence on it. Is it coming up on its lifespan? All of those things can be tracked, and you can put preventative maintenance around that to help identify, reduce cost, and potentially position your operation for the benefits that go with that. And the database decisions, touching base on all of those, they definitely drive your cost efficiencies. The visibility into operations really assists your areas in historically reducing those service costs by about 20%. I mean, it's so important to get good data and track that good data. And if you get bad data, I mean, you might want to collect something else. There's no harm in getting rid of bad data that you once started collecting a year ago that no longer provides any benefit. That's the constant change in the environments of creating new areas that you want to look and capture, removing not redundant, but obsolete data that's not good anymore from your databases as well. So again, I would challenge everybody to consider that this year, how technology can assist you in a meaningful way as you move forward and take a look at some of the technology that's out there. And a quick internet search will give you a whole list of companies that provide, in many ways, some very cost-effective softwares that can really benefit your operation in a meaningful way.
Joe, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe, thanks very much for taking us through the technology and the process.
And then hit the next slide, Brendan, if you hit that.
Yeah, hang on. Sorry. Go ahead.
And this is kind of a wrap-up slide. You're really looking at how all of the pieces that on a daily basis tie together. What we're looking to help and kind of relay to you as a manager out there in the field. It's a graphical representation of people, process, and technologies, how they all benefit together. The people, the key. That's our most valuable resource. The cornerstone of our operation, and in this case, the left wall of the graphic itself. Establishing and noting clients and company objectives is key to our understanding what's going on. Leveraging that with process improvements through defined process measures, as we talked to them earlier, staff synergies, reevaluating KPIs, understanding the performance management systems that's going on out there. Tie that in with facility systems, the data veracity that's available when you implement one of these systems into your marketplace, into your environment itself. That technology in itself will really lend itself to finding out where you are, drive customer satisfaction, and then all of those together lead to cost savings and other initiatives that are going to benefit your operation in a very positive way. And then, Brendan, next slide. I've handed back to you, I believe.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. Appreciate that. So we've talked a lot about looking at non-traditional or different areas of facilities that you may not have thought about before. And we've talked about what components of those areas you need to look at: people, process, and technology. And this slide really just talks about what a typical engagement between your organization and a qualified outsource provider might look like. So it really begins with, or starts with, collaboration. You really need to be working together to establish goals, establish objectives, set baselines, and that really moves into then the assess and analyze phase of the relationship. And this is where qualified, credentialed solutions architects are looking at the different functions and evaluating people, process, and technology. And they're designing the processes or making recommendations. And during this phase of making recommendations, again, working together with the client to fine-tune those recommendations and come up with a final designed process. You would move from there to change and transition. So change and transition is really nothing more than if it made sense what you all collaborated on, and it made sense what the outsourced provider was recommending, you would move on to implementing those recommendations, and that's the change and transition process. You then move on to managing the operations, and this is really where you're kind of laying the foundation, getting the right people on the bus, wrong people off the bus, putting into place new process designs, really laying the foundation for more future world-class service, and that's the improve and control phase, where you're just constantly looking for continuous improvement. Some of the events that Joe talked about, you know, Six Sigma, to have best practices, people look at the existing state and look for opportunities for improvement, to conduct things like Kaizen events and 5S+1 events to look for opportunities for continuous improvement. And I would say really on this slide, and I'm certain many or all of the attendees on this call have been through some kind of similar process with a supplier or maybe even internally with a Six Sigma or continuous improvement team. But I think what we find, maybe the riskiest phase of this whole process is that change and transition phase. And you've been collaborating with the supplier, you've been communicating, but I guess what we would recommend is that during this phase of the relationship, communications would really have to be at an all-time high, because there's a change management component to it where end users need to be made aware of what's going on. There's a lot of training that has to happen. There's a lot of changes in workflow and processes. So that's probably, that's a 60, 90-day period that really needs to be managed carefully, and something that a lot of thought needs to be put into. We just move on to some case studies. We've got two case studies here. This first one, and I'm not going to read these to you, but I'll give you the short story. This was a large energy company that was consolidating onto a large campus. They needed to provide services, and by their own admission, they lacked the resources, they lacked the expertise and experience to even establish what services at the campus could be integrated. How many people will it take to provide these services? What are the safety risks? What are the most effective processes, and what best practices could be brought to the operation? And in the end, they leveraged our resources, our expertise, and our experience, and we developed an integrated corporate campus logistics solution that delivers very safe, efficient, cost-efficient, and high levels of customer satisfaction. So it's something they were able to wash their hands of, and something they were able to achieve without tying up resources of their own. This next case study is very much the same results, but very different in that the first scenario were operations, facility services that had to be created from scratch, and these were mature, established operations. This company was going through a merger, and they absolutely just had to save money. So we're collaborating with them on the very front end, clearly setting expectations for cost savings, putting percentages and dollar amounts out there that have to be reduced, establishing, one of their major objectives was they had to eliminate headcount, kind of a Wall Street thing, but they just had to reduce headcount. They had already gone through layoffs, but they needed to even go a little bit deeper. So outsourcing became a solution for that. And again, in the end, they leveraged our resources, our expertise and experience, and we completely re-engineered how mail, shipping and receiving, warehouse management, and production print are being managed. And in the end, with no degradation to services whatsoever, we were able to save them $1.25 million a year at one particular campus. So that's just another good case study. And this is the last slide, just a couple of key takeaways for everyone to think about. I think in the end, we can either reduce costs or improve customer service. You can do both at once. It just requires a very close examination of services and following of the value life cycle model that we talked about earlier. But you can achieve both at the same time. And it's more than just traditional services that can impact your facility's budget. So it requires a little bit of progressive, creative thinking. The view of the purpose of a facility is changing. It's no longer, it's not just a workplace. It has to be a place that can be a showcase, that can aid in the recruiting and retainment of great people, that's going to, accommodate the changing service expectations of the new generation of employee that's coming into the workplace. There's more challenges than just reducing costs. And everyone that's attending this probably has forgotten more about the challenges they're faced with every day than we even thought of. But it's not just reduce cost and improve customer satisfaction. There's a million different challenges that each one of you is faced with every day. But you have to evaluate people, process, and technology. And I think that last bullet is, the way to do that without tying up existing resources, maybe a chance to put a fresh set of eyes onto operations, a chance to just get out of the day-to-day, kind of pull your head up out of the weeds of, just trying to get through the quarter or the month or whatever the case might be, to just engage a qualified outsource provider in assessment and look at the different operations and see if there's opportunities to improve services and reduce costs. So that's what we had for our presentation today. Again, we appreciate everybody attending. And I think at this point, we would just open it up for any questions that anyone might have.
Yes, we will. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Yes, we do have some questions, and I will pose them to you now. First, let's start with, as far as the 3 steps that were covered, advancing people, processes, and technology, the 3 pillars, so to speak, of making some changes and improvements. Can you just talk about where it makes sense for facilities people to start in this process, and which step might provide the most cost savings? What does that look like?
So I would say, it's if you engage with a outsource provider, you look at, pick to where to start. Just pick a particular function. So, how is warehousing and distribution of those materials being managed at the campus? What are the goals? What are the driving factors for wanting to look? Is it because services are deficient and materials aren't efficiently getting to end users in a timely fashion, or is this, this is just a cost savings exercise that we have to engage in? And then that process is to really turn solutions architect or analysts into those operations, and they can very kind of discreetly observe operations. And these are typically not, McKinsey level studies where there are teams of people in for, weeks and months. It could be, an analyst or 2 observing operations for a couple of days, spending some time with the management, maybe working with the different shifts in the operation. And that enables us to come up with recommendations and to sit down with the client and kind of fine tune those recommendations that could ultimately be implemented during a change and transition phase.
Right, and Brendan,
and
Brendan, it's Joe. If I can add to that, I definitely start, and I think you hit it right on the head. You start in the process area, processes that seem to be, redundant, unnecessary, or maybe unusually complex. From there, you'll see a natural progression of labor possibilities and technology requirements that would come out of just identifying and reviewing those. So that'll help drive it as well.
Thank you. And along that vein, if there was a facilities person that wanted to, and this question is for me, wanted to begin this journey, so to speak, or looking at improvements, what would you say, and I imagine that it varies, but what would you say is kind of the timeline? I know you had mentioned 60 to 90 days in terms of starting the process and then maybe getting a plan in place, if I'm correct, but then how long until maybe an organization is seeing the first results? And again, I understand there's probably a lot of variables, but from implementation or beginning of implementation to first results, is there an average there, or what could you say on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it is going to vary greatly depending on the size and scope and complexity of an operation and what we're looking at. But a typical timeline for engagement would be, starting with collaboration to establishing goals and what you want to achieve, to the time that you have a fine-tuned kind of plan in an organization's hands. That's really no more than 30 days, provided that there's access being, granted and all that. That's really like a 30-day plan. The transition, if in fact that organization elected to, and in some cases organizations elect to implement some of the recommendations on their own, or we get hired. When we get hired, that transition phase is really, again, depending on size and scope and complexity and how we're dealing with the people. That's a 30, 60, 90 day, 30 for maybe a simple type of operation, 90 days for a more enterprise-wide complex type of solution. And then during that period, you're really just laying the groundwork. So we don't want to set any false expectations that are immediately going to turn an organization's world upside down and deliver, millions of dollars in savings during that period. I mean, what we absolutely are hoping for is that it becomes the transition becomes a bit of a non-event. That there's, that we're just then being able to move into continuous management and continuous improvement. And I would say that's 6 to 9 months, and then forever after that. So if you begin to look now, you could have an impact in your business in 2017, I guess is the short answer.
Thank you. So then I have another question that Brendan, you may want to answer, and Joe, of course, jump in if you would like. Several property management firms have moved towards a more flexible and modified outsourcing integrated facility management model. This is where the client retains their FM institutional knowledge and supplements their respective FM teams with subject matter experts in hard and soft services, new work order technologies, help desk, strategic sourcing, and more. JLL calls it their Flex program. What is your experience with this model?
So we do act as a subcontractor in many of those cases. So it becomes that an organization can really get maybe the best of the best. So it becomes a very simplified solution for the client in that the corporate real estate company, JLL for instance, can provide one budget, one number to a client to manage all their facilities, and then subsequently subcontract. And it could even go back to that wheel that we talked about. They may be responsible for janitorial, pest control, landscaping, snow removal, these types of things, and put it all under one budget, under one supplier, and it just becomes a very flexible, simplified way for organizations to manage their facilities. And we do play a role in that, they'll sometimes subcontract many of the areas that we touched on earlier to an organization like ourselves.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, and we now have a question about assessing staff, just to drill down a bit into the people part of the equation. Early on, in the presentation in Maximizing People, you had mentioned assessing staff can reduce facility services by about 20%. How do I begin that facilities assessment? I think you covered it a little bit, but if you can add a few more points on that.
Yep. I mean, it goes back to that engagement process. And as Joe said, we're probably looking at process design first, and then extrapolating back out from that. What does that mean to the people? How does that impact the amount of staff that's required to deliver services? But we do, and any qualified outsource provider would provide the flexibility to retain legacy staff. The first choice is to want to include them in any kind of solution that's developed. There's intellectual capital there that we want to capture. We want to create opportunities for these people. So it's just part and parcel of the overall assessment analyze process. But organizations should feel good that the outsource provider wants to include their people, and in fact, in a downsizing situation, can open up opportunities for those individuals at places like other sites and in other locations and other services. So it doesn't become a chance where people are, losing jobs. It's just making operations more efficient.
Thank you. And we do have another question about evaluating service providers. At what point does one look at a service provider itself if they're not up to your standards or have not delivered desired results? So I guess at what point is there a change needs to be made, or what goes into that evaluation from your perspective?
We get asked all the time to look at competitive operations. So I think in many cases it's either because a service provider could be quote unquote falling down, but in most cases it's at contract termination that we have very few clients, and we get about half of our business today from competitive. So about half of our business comes from internal operations that are outsourcing for the first time, and the other half of the business is really coming from our competitors, where the company is making a change and making a switch. So I would say, when do you do that? Listen, if a company is absolutely falling down, yes, it's probably time that you look at alternatives. But we typically do 5-year agreements with our clients, and they'll always shop it at the end of a contract and just reissue an RFP through procurement. So that would probably, that would be the timing of when organizations look at it.
And Brendan, this is Joe. To add to that, that's some of the key. You talked about evaluating data, evaluating performance. Performances of a vendor in that type of environment. Establishing those really sound SLAs and good KPIs gives you a starting point to evaluate on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis with that particular vendor, and you'll be able to measure that. And if they have a failure to meet a couple of SLAs and then they can't correct it, or their KPIs are way off from what they should be, then you have some justifications for at least some talk through, and if they can't remediate that, then you have some justifications to source another vendor if they're not meeting it. That's where those are key. Establishing those up front with your vendors, good sound SLAs, good KPIs, really help put you in a solid position to be able to do that.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And looks like those are all our questions for the day. So I do want to thank you, Brendan and Joe, for the presentation and for taking the questions at the end.
Our pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
And I would, of course, like to thank our audience for sending in questions and for participating and listening in today, and to Canon Business Process Services for sponsoring the webinar. A recording of the webinar will be available online for your reference at facilityexecutive.com, as well as on the Canon website, and that's www.cbps.canon.com. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.